Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go. I'm excited to bring to you today Dani Nierenberg. She is the co-founder and president of Food Tank, an organization that I belong to and follow religiously on topics of food around the globe and really here in the US on what we can do with our current food system. So welcome to the show, Dani, and thank you for doing this at the very end of the year.
Oh, thanks for having me, Tracy, and thanks for the work that you do. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And I did have the opportunity to meet you in person at the Raleigh conference that you had at NC State. That was a great conversation. And for everybody, can you tell everybody what Food Tank is and what it does?
Sure. So Food Tank is a research and advocacy organization that's really devoted to highlighting stories of hope and success, both internationally and domestically, so that we can inspire, motivate, and really activate the private sector, eaters, farmers, and governments to make transformative changes in our food system.
Well, okay, so right there, what kind of transformative changes do you think that need to be happening or need to be done based on what we've seen in 2002 or 2022 coming out of COVID?
I mean, I think so many things were unveiled during COVID that we shouldn't forget, but I feel like a lot of us are already sort of forgetting them. I mean, the focus on workers during the pandemic and really highlighting and lifting that sort of veil of what goes on in processing plants or for restaurant workers or for farm workers, I think is really important. And what you've seen during 2022 is lots of organizing and farm workers and organizing themselves collectively to make change, whether it's at Starbucks or Amazon or wherever else. And I think that's really exciting and something to watch in 2023 for what transformations we can see around food activism.
And based on COVID, there was a lot of people who had never had to visit a food bank before, right? And they had to have that experience, and maybe some of them are still doing that. Do you think the food banks COVID has helped them, or has it still put a damper on them a little bit?
I mean, there's been an enormous strain on food banks, and we depend on charity to provide safe, healthy, delicious food for the citizens of the United States of America, the richest country on earth, then we have a problem. And so I think the strain on food banks and the lines of people waiting for hours and hours to get a box of food, I think is deplorable. And as you said, people are still depending on that. Food banks have their place, but they need more support. And this is an opportunity for policy and governments, municipal governments, as well as the Fed, to really step in and make a serious change.
So speaking of that, I want to jump back a couple of months. And so the White House had their conference on food, nutrition, and hunger. And I know you were there. What do you think is going to come out of that? Because that was the first conference in 50 years.
51 years. Yeah. The first conference that really focused on hunger, but not just hunger, but health and nutrition. So I mean, I sort of described it. It was like a homecoming or your class reunion, because you see all of the people in the food movement who you admire and love. And that was great for us all to get together. But now the action needs to come out of it. And the White House came out with a plan for what they'd like to do to encourage healthier food. Food is medicine, all of these things that I think, again, can be transformative, but they need that support behind them. It can't just be from the White House. It has to be from congressional members. Folks like Jim McGovern, who's a food superhero, in my opinion. He's been leading the charge on these issues for a long time, but we need many, many more of him to do the kind of work that will actually solve hunger and health, our hunger crises, our health crises in the United States.
And then, so then let's jump to that as well. Is like this past week, last week, we actually had a good breakthrough in some of that help with the Food Donation Act that was approved by both Congress and Senate and is now going to the White House. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the Food Donation Improvement Act, it was a great Christmas or Hanukkah present, whatever you want to look at it. On December 21st, it was passed with a lot of bipartisan support to really improve how donated food can reach people who need it the most. Previous to that, we had the Good Samaritan Act, the Emerson Act, that did a lot of that, but it had some challenges, including USDA didn't sort of oversee it. There were lots of loopholes where people thought they could still be liable if they donated perfectly good food and someone by a chance got sick. Now, a lot of that is eliminated. It makes it, for one thing, really easier for farmers to donate excess produce and that kind of thing so that they can get a tax credit so that it's not just, again, charity. Farmers should be compensated for everything that they do. So getting that kind of credit will be very helpful. But this was, again, going back, such a bipartisan bill, and it's really nice to see that we can still figure out ways to work across the aisle, that Republicans and Democrats can come together on an issue that should not be partisan at all. This is the health and the future of Americans. And so how can we make it easier for these kinds of legislations around food and agriculture? How can they be more bipartisan in the future?
And so the meetings industry, and I think I've shared this with you in the past, is that we spend $64 billion a year on food and beverage just in the US. And if you take the statistics that 30 to 40% of that is wasted, this will actually help not be wasted. It can actually be donated.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a huge, I think, opportunity for the hospitality industry to make change on what we're seeing happen with food waste. Not just the sort of moral problem of people going hungry while there's perfectly good food to be eaten, but also the environmental problems associated with food waste. A lot of the food, you know this better than anyone, ends up in the garbage and then subsequently in landfills where it contributes to greenhouse gas emissions and all of these statistics. But if food waste were a country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases. We need to stop that. If we really care about climate, if we care about solving the climate crisis, we need to address food loss and food waste.
Well, and I think it will help a lot of people, a lot of event planners, a lot of hoteliers also not waste money on food that's not going to go uneaten, right?
Right.
Be better prepared, right?
Yeah. And there's certainly lots of tools for that now. I mean, I think there's more and more information out there for folks who are working in hospitality and event planning to sort of understand portion sizes, to understand how much food they need to order and that kind of thing. And that ultimately saves money. So again, we're not just talking about the moral issue or the environmental side of this, but also the economic against of a bill like.
Just one little tangent of that. I'm sure that a lot of the pushback from hoteliers and catering companies to donate is the liability aspect of that. And I know there's a line in there that really, it takes that liability out, but you also have those lawyers for all those companies that put that out there. Is this really going to help sway them?
That is what it is intended to do, is to remove that concern about liability. And that's what the Emerson Act, obviously under the Clinton administration, was unable to do. People still felt that there was a lot of liability involved. So I think that this will help encourage those lawyers to not be so worried. And by the way, nobody's ever brought a lawsuit against the Emerson Act because they've gotten sick. That has just not happened. I mean, knock on wood. But people are not getting sick from donated food if it is handled properly. There has to be a proper chain of food safety protocols. But otherwise, this food shouldn't go to waste if it can reach seniors or homeless folks or others who really need it.
And I think it's just coming down to figuring out those systems as well, because with staffing issues in the hotel industry as well, it's like, somebody said one time, please don't make me do this. And I think it may have been from staffing issues, things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I think this is a problem what we're seeing all along the entire sort of food system right now, because you have a lack of labor. You have this awareness that's growing, but people are already overworked and underpaid. And so how do you encourage that to be easier for them? And so we need that infrastructure, both the sort of physical infrastructure and the intellectual infrastructure, to make it easier for folks.
Exactly. Okay. Well, I'm very, very excited about that. And we will be promoting it everywhere. What are our ending 2022, going into 2023, what are our most pressing environmental and agricultural and food issues that we should be looking at as individuals, as well as people who buy food for thousands of people on a daily basis?
I mean, I think when we're looking at what's happening in the world right now, Ukraine presents an enormous challenge over the next year with the Russian aggression and the war against Ukraine. I mean, we've already seen supply chains shortages, farmers not being able to get their crops planted or harvested. There's going to be enormous shortages of grain for sub-Saharan Africa. Russia and Ukraine were big providers of that. So I think it's a big challenge. I think we can also, despite all of the pain and suffering that this war has caused, look at it as an opportunity for some of the things that we learned during COVID, that there's an opportunity to have more regionalized and local food systems, that there are better sort of grains than wheat that can be used in places like sub-Saharan Africa, which traditionally grew a lot of millet and sorghum, which are very nutritious. And again, when processed, in a way that makes them delicious, can be a staple for folks. So I think it's a terrible time, sort of, when you look globally at our food crises. But it's also this enormous opportunity, and I think we have a lot to learn. Then on top of that, I mean, for me, it's the climate crisis, because that touches so many of the other crises that I see around the world, whether it's the health crisis or the biodiversity loss crisis or conflict, as I just talked about, or the lack of education for youth to be involved in farming. These are all linked. If we don't have young people who want to farm and do it in a sustainable way, then the climate crisis will continue. I think, what a lot of folks are beginning to understand is that our food system contributes dramatically to climate change. It's about 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions. If we can solve for food, we can solve for all of these other things that are happening. And that will go a long way in getting us toward a more climate secure future for our children and their grandchildren and it just goes on and on. So I think we have opportunities here, but we have to act now. The urgency is really here.
Well, and that reminds me of a newsletter you just sent out. At the very bottom of it, and one of the stories you were telling, it was about stories to teach books for young kids. Can you talk a little bit about that, the couple that's doing that?
Yeah, we were talking about Readers to Eaters, which is an organization that publishes children's books about food heroes, whether it's Sandor Katz, who does a lot on fermentation, or Chef Alice Waters in California, just really highlighting these food heroines and heroes who are doing incredible things and getting kids to be interested about food from a very early age. And so it was really fun to put that together, and I hope it was helpful for parents and caregivers who want to teach their kids about food but don't always have the resources.
That reminds me also that Jamie Oliver tried to do that a decade and 15 years ago.
Badly.
Yeah. And the fact that we're still having to bring that back and do that and educate them on where their food comes from is something that we need to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's so important to have gardening in school and make it a part of the entire curriculum. You can learn a lot about math and science and reading if you have a school garden. I think teachers can link a lot to that. But again, it comes down to resources and what school boards are able to do, what administrators are able to do. I think we just need to be thinking about food differently to make sure that it's not sort of a burden to teach kids about food later in life, that they learn it from a very early age.
Right. And then they learn to love even a broader perspective of food, not just what we see in the grocery store on a daily basis. Yeah. So you travel the world, and just before the show, you've got a couple of trips coming up as well. So because my audience is a lot of event planners, you travel the world attending events as well as hosting events. What innovations have you seen in food service pre-COVID, during COVID, coming out of that? And what would you like to see going forward?
I mean, I think it's been exciting to see the number of options that are provided during events now that weren't provided maybe a decade ago. You have more people who are concerned about providing plant-forward options. You have people who are helping gluten-free people eat at conferences safely. You have planners who are concerned about food waste. And I think post-COVID, you're seeing a lot of more packaging. This is what I've seen anyway. A lot of more boxed things, less plated service, less buffets for sure, right? And so I don't know how we get away from that in the short term, but I think over the long term, all that packaging, even though some of it's like labeled as compostable or recyclable, there's a real sort of you all have a very big challenge as event planners to provide food safely that makes people feel comfortable when we're still in a pandemic, whether we want to be or not. And to make people feel comfortable, that packaging might be necessary over the short term, but we have to think about how to deal with it over the long term. And I know so many people are concerned about this. And whether it's encouraging people to bring their own water bottles, their own like utensils, these things, are providing them as freebies so people don't have to use plastic forks and that kind of thing. I think there's some opportunities there, but it's going to be a challenge for you all.
Yeah. So on that note too, and kind of being more sustainable, and a lot of the stuff that I read and you talk about too is using local farm systems, right? And on a global perspective, if you're thinking Las Vegas, I mean, a 17,000 person, a convention for 17,000 is not really going to be able to rely on a local farmer.
Sure.
How can we balance that out using locally, but also having this global food system with the challenges that we currently have?
Well, I mean, I think you see your Compasses and your Sodexos starting to change. These food service providers, they know that their clientele, like you or the people down the chain, that the people going to these events are getting more and more concerned about the environment and about our food systems and about workers and all of these things. And so they're trying to change. So I think you need that change in the sort of the big private sector. But it takes people like you to really encourage them to do that, to say, like, my clients want more sustainable food. They want more plant forward food. They want this and that. They want to feel good about that the food wasn't wasted at this event. So I think those big food service providers are really changing, because, and I hate to go back to this word and repeat myself, but it is an opportunity. If you can get ahead of this, because you have a whole generation of consumers, of eaters who really, really care about where their food comes from, they're not going to let you get away with this anymore. And so if you don't make changes now, you're going to be out of business.
Okay, so that jumps back to the interview that you did. I think it was at the Nyman Ranch, and you were with Kim Severson and the woman from Google whose name I don't remember.
June Jolie.
Both conversations were very intriguing about can you summarize a little bit about what both of them said? Because they kind of agreed, but then Kim had a little...
Yeah, they were talking about Generation Z and the kinds of things that they're concerned about. They don't sort of label themselves as vegan or omnivore or whatever, flexitarian. They're really looking at food as sort of part of their identity, right? That it's a part of who they are. And that's such an interesting way to think about it. And really, we want a generation of folks who consider themselves part of the food system. For, the last 70 years, 80 years, Americans especially have been disconnected from their food system kind of on purpose, right? Because of the Green Revolution. And now we're seeing that this urge by those folks, their grandchildren, to really reconnect with where our food comes from. And so it's really interesting to me. And I don't know how it will all play out when these Gen Zers are full-fledged adults and making economic decisions, if they'll continue to look at food as part of their identity. But I think there's this opportunity there to provide them with something that's different, that's better for them, better for the world. We have so many diet-related diseases. Do we want to continue that generation after generation? I don't think so. Maybe there's some of the big food companies do, but I don't think that's the purpose of this food system. We need to make that change now.
How do you get those big food companies to change? Is there a way to do that?
I mean, I think for people like me, if you'd asked me 10 or 15 years ago if I'd be talking to big food companies, I would have said, no, I don't want to be involved with them. I consider them the sort of the other side. But now I talk to them all the time. And I think that's very important. Food Tank has a chief sustainability officer working group made up of small, medium, and large scale companies across the food and agriculture sectors. And it's really interesting to hear from them about the sustainability challenges that they're facing, because they know they have to change. So climate change is too big of an issue, that the needs of consumers are changing. They have to change. But it's very hard for them to do so on their own. And again, it gets back to, like, if you're a company that has a lot of shareholders who don't want those changes, then how do you do it? So I think they face a lot of challenges, and it should be organizations and individuals who are helping them make those changes.
Well, and then thinking about their boards are not the Gen Z. Their boards are baby boomers and other ones. So getting them to talk together is important.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. How food justice and food security, we talked a little bit about upfront the Donation Act and food banks, but what can we do individually, locally to help with food justice and food security?
I mean, it depends what's going on in your backyard. And I think people can no longer sort of ignore what's happening in their own communities. And whether you live in Baltimore, where I do, or Boston, where my co-founder does, there's lots of opportunities to be more connected to the people who are either growing or processing or providing food to you, or folks in need, and connecting yourselves to local gardens and those kinds of things. I mean, I think it's just understanding that food especially has become sort of a weapon that is used against those who are of color. It's used against poor people. There were put in place that sort of created these systems of food deserts or food apartheid in communities, and that those policies need to be changed, and that communities can who have experienced food apartheid, they know where their resources are, but they need investment. So giving to organizations like the Black Farmers Fund, giving to local organizations that you find on your own, I think is very important, so that we can change this system, and that we don't have those food deserts or places where food apartheid exists.
How does helping smaller farmers get their foot in the ground, pun intended, dig into the ground and grow? Because like where I am in New Bern, North Carolina, which is 2 hours east of the big city of Raleigh, at our farmers market, there's maybe 4 farmers, and the rest are arts and crafts. And it's hard for them to get their foot in the ground to grow and get more business. How can we help that or find them?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many problems that new or young farmers faced sort of trying to get into farming. They lack access to land. They lack access to education around farming. They lack access to the business skills that they need. And a lot of them are working in several jobs. So I think it's important to, if you can go to farm stands that are outside folks' farms, do that. But also encourage your policymakers to make changes that would remove student loan debt for farmers, especially young farmers, so that they can spend more time on the land, so that they can come to a farmer's market like yours, because they have the sort of yield available and they have the time available. They're not so concerned all of the bills that they have to pay. Provide universal health care for farmers. These are all changes that could greatly increase the number of small farmers, small and medium scale farmers. I'm not saying that we need to do away with large farms at all, but we could have more of a farming in the middle if we provided those resources to farmers. They're doing the most important thing that anyone can do. They're growing food, they're stewarding the land, they're helping solve some of these problems that we've talked about already. And if we don't support them, then we're putting ourselves in peril.
Yeah. And we take for granted that they are the ones growing our food. Even the stuff that's in the canned in the grocery store, right? The canned food in the grocery store. They grew that for us, but we just don't see that person. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was looking at one of my other questions. The food is in a couple of different interviews that you've done over the year. And I talk about this as well, is that food is very personal. It's cultural, it's medically, religiously, belief wise. How can we link those different aspects of food for a more productive, healthy, and global food system?
Well, I mean, it's because you kind of just said it. You have to recognize that these things are interlinked, that food isn't just a source of calories, that it is very cultural. It is something that you can use as a tool to protect the environment. It's a tool to improve your health. It's a tool for all of these things. And so just understanding that we are not disconnected from our food and farming systems. They are not just ingredients. They are part of who we are. And I think understanding that is sort of the first step. And so, yeah, I mean, the interlinkages are so relevant and so there.
It's understanding that somebody who is Jewish and follows a kosher diet could actually be gluten-free as well. And we're Jewish, if they grew up in New York versus growing up in Southern California, their culture is different. Absolutely. In that respect. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, go ahead.
We were talking to a group that works with school systems and where there's a lot of Muslim students, and we are not good in this country at providing meals that are appealing to Muslim students. And I think that's another sort of barrier where we're not looking at the cultural aspects of food, and that we're like, kids are going hungry. Muslim kids are going hungry because they don't want to eat what's provided to them. And I don't blame them because it doesn't fit with their culture. And so thinking about those things, I think, is really, really important if we want to, again, make those linkages that you highlighted.
Well, and that reminds me of a story of a general manager of a corporate cafeteria. And this was a couple years ago, but she made sure that all of the food served in that corporate cafeteria was halal certified, except for the pork, so that, because it was a tech company, so making sure that everybody that came through was able to eat. And then when somebody who was Jewish and needed specific parameters, the company actually ended up subsidizing his salary because the food was free for everybody to eat, but they couldn't meet his needs. And I think that's a great way to look at that perspective as well.
Absolutely.
And food is at work, it's at home, it's at corporations, et cetera. And we take it for granted. So what positive things do you see coming through for 2023 that we can put on our radar?
I mean, I think there's so much positive. I've been reading a lot about, like, what other experts are, in addition to people like you, are predicting for the new year in terms of like what's going to be available to consumers. And I think we've had a lot of progress on climate friendly foods. So there's moonshot crackers, for example, where, they're sort of taking carbon out of the atmosphere. They're a regenerative food source. There are all these other products. Oatly has a carbon labeling system, Oatly oat milk. So I think we're going to see more climate friendly foods that are legitimate, that are very transparent, that you can trace what they're doing, that consumers can feel good about them and know they're doing something good for the planet. And I think we just got back last month from COP27 in Egypt, and there was such a great youth presence, despite sort of the crackdown on protests and that kind of thing. But there was a whole sort of more youth on panels at the conference than I've ever seen, more youth negotiators, in the rooms, sort of hammering out the climate deal. I think that's really important to get their perspectives in the room, because they're going to have to clean up the mess that we're all of us are leaving for them. So I think those are things that give me hope. Youth and always give me hope. The ideas that innovators are coming up with, farmers are, as we talked about earlier, more resilient and innovative and tenacious than ever. So I think if we can figure out ways to make sure that they're supported, we'll go a long way in having a really happy future.
That's great. And I love the fact that there were younger people in the conversations. One thing that you said there, and understanding like where, just being the regenerative thing with Oatly and things, there's labels on different kinds of food, right? Is it gluten-free? Is it this? Is it, now they're all escaping my brain, farm raised or
animal welfare friendly? Sure.
Yeah, exactly. How do we know which ones are true to fact?
Yeah, I think so much onus has been placed on eaters or consumers to make decisions, to sort of understand these labels when they're just trying to get food on the table for dinner. And so I think we need to really make it more clear for eaters what exactly these labels mean. But it's difficult. You have fair trade, you have animal welfare labels, you have climate labels. It's giving a lot for consumers to think about, which I love because it creates that awareness, but it's also making these decisions harder. So I think grocery stores and retailers have a lot of work to do and really helping consumers sort of in a quick and easy way understand what those labels mean. Organizations like mine certainly do. I'm sure you have this sort of issue in your own work. We all need to sort of be streamlining it for them so that they understand that. Last year, we worked with edible magazines, edible communities to write an article on food labeling. But again, it's very complex. And it depends on what your values are too as a consumer. Are you mostly concerned about animal welfare? Are you mostly concerned about workers and fair trade? Are you mostly concerned about the climate? It's a shame that there's not a label that can sort of cover everything that you can feel good about and believe in.
Very, very true. And I was talking to one farmer who farms fish, and he's like, we're like, what certifications do you have? Well, I don't have any. You just have to trust me. And I don't know if I can do that at the same time, right?
Sure.
I don't know who you are, right? And I'm not going to your farm, so I don't know necessarily what that is. So it is a challenge to find that right certification, I guess.
Yeah, and the right balance. You want to know where your things come from.
One of the things that you said earlier too is plant forward. And there's been a lot of discussion. I follow people on both sides of the table, and I've heard you say that before. I mean, trying to go plant forward or vegan globally, I think would be very hard. But how do we balance meat as well as plant forward?
Yeah, it's a shame that it's such a divisive issue. I think if you understand food and agriculture systems, it becomes apparent that going vegan for everyone across the world probably is just not a good idea. It's not a good idea for the land. It's not a good idea in terms of health. It's not a good idea in terms of culture. I think meat and our food in general is such a personal thing, but especially meat. What I hope that people will understand that is that our industrial meat systems, the industrial operations, the factory farms are no longer sustainable. They've been efficient, but they are not sustainable in terms of the pollution they put out, this sort of environmental injustice that they inflict on communities, their greenhouse gas emissions, the meat that they provide, or dairy products or eggs are not as nutritious as organic or regeneratively produced products. So I think we need a sort of a reset. We need the subsidies to go towards those regenerative systems, and we need more penalties placed on the industrial systems, because the only reason that they can produce meat that's cheap is because they're subsidized, and that can no longer go on. So I think it's not meat eaters versus vegans. It's really looking at how we can change the food system so it's better for everyone, that vegans and vegetarians and flexitarians and pescatarians can get what they want and do it in a way that's sustainable, and that the omnivores can too, because it shouldn't be an either or kind of thing. Like either you go vegan or you're a terrible person. That's not the way to solve these problems.
And vice versa too. People who say that about vegans as well, which actually now brings up the California the bill. And I know that they were taking it to the Supreme Court to say, hey, we can't do this. You can't do this to the pork farmers. I haven't seen anything from the Supreme Court.
I'm not sure. I haven't looked into it in a while either. I'm not sure where it stands, but if the reasoning behind that is, if California makes these sort of new sort of restrictions on factory farms around pork, then the rest of the country will have to follow it, because California is such a big state, and it imports a lot of food and exports a lot of food. So I think if you're looking at meat and you're looking at the changes that need to be made, having animals not so closely crowded together, giving them better care, allowing them to perform their natural behaviors, I don't think these are things that anyone can actually be against, because it's a sort of, again, it goes back to kind of a moral issue. Like, why would we want to crowd animals together to create a lot of manure, a lot of disease, a lot of unhappiness for animals and workers? Why would we want to do that when we know we can do it a better way? And so I think there's issues there that are more complex than just industry, but sort of are psychological too. So we'll wait and see what happens in California, but it's something to watch for sure.
Definitely. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time just 3 days before the end of the year to chat with me. I look forward to what Food Tank does in the coming years, or in the coming year and years. Where are you headed at the beginning of the year?
I get to go participate in the Oxford Food and Farming Conference in Oxford and see where Harry Potter was filmed and talk about food to people. So I'm kind of excited.
Yeah. Are they going to serve you what Harry Potter
Who
Potter
knows? Who knows? Some butterbeer, I'm not sure. No, but I think it's a good way to start off the new year with a lot of smart people who think about these issues. I have a lot to learn and a lot to talk about.
That's awesome. All right. So one final question, or two final questions before I ask everybody, is what does a safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experience mean to you?
A safe, inclusive food and beverage and sustainable. I mean, it means it feels I could eat in my own home. It feels like it would be an experience where I would be confident that the food was procured in a way that I feel good about, that it's delicious, that it's fun to eat, that it's something I would be happy to give my stepkids. That's kind of what it means to me.
Okay, awesome. And then what is your favorite food and beverage?
My favorite food and beverage. Gosh, bourbon. My favorite food. I have so many favorite foods. It's hard to sort of nail it down. I thought about this before we got on the line, but it's just hard for me because I eat very plant forward, right? So it's a mixture of foods often, a lot of the time, that really delights my palate. But I love beans. I love rice. I love anything that, is sort of, I can mix it in a bowl and heat it up and make it taste good. So
that's good. That's good. That means you're very flexible in what you can eat. So again, Dani, I really appreciate it. Thank you. I hope you had a wonderful holiday with your family, and
you too.
Thank you. Safe travels for the new year. And I look forward to finding you somewhere in the universe here sometime next year to attend a food tank event in the future. And everyone, you can reach her, at foodtank.com. Lots of great articles, lots of great learning for everybody there. So, and any parting words? Actually, I have one last question in here. So I don't drink alcohol. What alcoholic beverages are sustainable?
This is a really growing movement, honestly, that I haven't followed a lot, but there's more regenerative grains being grown for certain spirits and the wine industry. I just talked to a wine purveyor the other day who's using a lot of the ingredients that sort of are left over from wine to make other ingredients. So they're using upcycling products. So it's a really growing industry. It's very exciting.
Yeah, I met some guy at the Natural Products Expo who was taking the leftover cherry flower power, but he was having a hard time figuring out how to sell it.
Yeah,
like, what do they do with that? So
yeah. That's the conundrum for sure.
Oh, and Joan just asked the same follow-up question. Are hospitality providers buying them? Joan, I'm going to say probably restaurants are, but I don't see any hotels buying them at this point. We have to push to, and again, it's something Dani said, is like, we have to make those requests to get the stuff in, because as many menus as I've looked at lately, I don't see any kind of regenerative or non-alcoholic beverages and vegan beverages at all on menus. So, yeah. Thank you again. I appreciate it. Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.